Very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, later today, the House of Representatives will pass a proposal that is supported by 97% of Americans. This is a proposal to make sure that anybody in this country who wants to buy a gun in a legitimate transaction has to go through a background check that in 90% of cases takes less than 5 minutes of time. That background check assures that only people who should be buying guns and owning guns buy and own guns. People that don't have violent criminal histories, people who don't have histories of serious mental illness. It's a popular proposal. It's an impactful proposal. It will save thousands of lives all across this country. And I wanted to come down to the floor today to just remind my colleagues why this is so important. And I want to tell you a quick story to try to put a little meat on the bone when it comes to this conversation we have here about the importance of making sure that people go through a background check before they buy a weapon. 2008 to 2012 is a period of time in this country's histories where violence is declining, homicides are declining, gun murders are declining. They're declining across the country, and specifically during that period of time, they're declining in the Midwest. And yet there is one state that stands out as this curious outlier during this period of time. That's the state of Missouri. In the state of Missouri, there's a dramatic jump during this period of time in gun homicides. In fact, it happens right away after 2007. 2008, 2009, about 50 to 60 to 70 additional people every year being murdered with guns inside Missouri. And so a researcher from Johns Hopkins went to try to figure out why this was. And I think it's important to tell that story on the floor today. Let me give you a little historical context first. During the Civil War, Missouri is one of the most violent, most dangerous places in the country because you've got these outlaws, these renegades of Confederates that are out in the bush. They call them the bushwhackers. Who are doing regular battle with Union troops. It's one of the first instances of true sustained guerrilla warfare in this nation. And when the Civil War was over, they didn't go home. They had been brutally put down by the Union, but they stuck around and they formed their own smaller criminal enterprises. We know about this because Jesse James and his brother Frank were amongst those who made their name as bushwhackers fighting the Union and then turned themselves into criminals that robbed stagecoaches and banks and trains. Well, to combat this post-Civil War continuation of violence, Missouri decided to change its firearms laws. And it started with a crackdown on the ability of individuals to conceal weapons. It extended to a change in the Constitution to make it perfectly clear that Missouri politicians had the ability to limit who could own guns and who couldn't. And eventually a provision got passed that said in order to own a handgun, you had to get a permit from your local authority. And as time went on, that permit came to include a background check. So that if you wanted to own a gun in Missouri, you had to go and get a background check. You had to prove that you did not have a serious criminal history or serious history of mental illness. What happens in 2007 is that very quietly that provision gets repealed. It was part of a much louder effort to repeal a whole host of gun laws in Missouri. Missouri kind of became the epicenter of the NRA's focus in the 2000s. It was this sort of southern, semi-southern state that still had pretty tough gun laws, and the NRA went all in, put their annual convention in St. Louis, spent millions of dollars trying to elect folks that would sign laws that they were pushing through the legislature. And in 2007, they finally got their way. They got all these laws that have been passed since the Civil War repealed. One of them was this law that requires you to get a background check before you buy a gun. And so this researcher from Johns Hopkins sort of looks at all these laws, controls for all sorts of other factors, and comes to a conclusion, and you should read the paper, it's very well done, that it is this provision, it's this provision that removes the background check that leads to this dramatic spike in violence. And he's got all sorts of interesting data to show you why that is. All the other violent crime in Missouri stays flat from 2008 to 2012, but gun crimes spikes, all of a sudden, guns bought in Missouri are being used in crimes all over the region. Other states start to report this increase, this curious, sudden increase in crime guns that were bought in Missouri. Well, guess why? It's because all of a sudden, you don't have to get a background check if you want to buy a gun in Missouri. All of a sudden, criminals, people with serious mental illness, they can get guns through gun shows and internet sales, transactions on the private market without that background check. And so I tell you this story because I hear opponents of this bill in the House saying that, this isn't meaningful, it won't work. These mass shootings, they weren't perpetuated with weapons that were bought without background checks. Well, that's true. This one public policy intervention won't stop every single bad thing that happens in this country. But the data is the data. And it shows us that states that have background checks have dramatically lower rates of gun crime than states that don't have them. A little bit earlier than the changes made in Missouri, my state of Connecticut made the opposite change. My state of Connecticut made a change to go from being a non-background check state to a background check state. We put in a local permit that came with a background checks requirement so that even if you bought your gun outside of a bricks and mortar gun store, you had to get a permit. And that permit required you to get a background check. Well, that same researcher goes to Connecticut, runs all the numbers, and finds out that in Connecticut, after that change was made, gun murders dropped by 40%. They increased in Missouri by about 25%, decreased in Connecticut by about 40%. And again, controlling for all sorts of other factors that could explain those changes. And so on both sides of the ledger, you have what I would tell you is incontrovertible evidence that if you're a state that has background checks, you are going to end up having much fewer gun crimes than if you're a state that doesn't have them. The problem is, as we saw in and around Missouri, is that guns don't respect borders. And so when Missouri dropped their gun background check requirement, those guns started moving into other states. And that's what happens in my state. The guns that are used to commit crimes in our cities, the guns that are trafficked out of the back of vans, aren't bought from Connecticut gun stores. They're bought by criminals in other states because they know they can go to gun shows, they can go on to internet sales in those other states and buy those weapons. Same thing happens as weapons move across our border. I've heard an awful lot from this president about how dangerous a place Mexico and Central America are. Well, there's some truth to that, but the guns that are being used in those crimes are trafficked from the United States of America. And the way they get to the southern border is through states that don't have background checks requirements. Just go online and check out what people say who have been arrested for gun trafficking. They tell you exactly how they did it. They go to gun shows in Texas, and they buy guns at unregulated gun shows in Texas, and they bring them back across the border and sell them in Central America. So we've got all the evidence we need, empirical evidence, anecdotal evidence, to pass this piece of legislation. But maybe the most important reason why we should pass it, we should take it up here in the Senate when it passes the House later today, is that it's just so darn popular. There really isn't anything else in America today that's as popular as universal background checks. The minimum score is about 90%. There's plenty of really good polling that says that 97% of Americans support universal background checks. Grandma isn't that popular. Apple pie isn't that popular. There's nothing that we debate here that gets 97% of agreement other than the issue of background checks. And so I'm here on the floor today to just try to fill in some of the details about why this is so important, to implore my colleagues, once it passes the House of Representatives, to bring it here. Obviously, I'd love to have a vote on the House bill, but I understand how this place works. We're going to send a letter to Chairman Graham asking him to, at the very least, convene a hearing on background checks in the Judiciary Committee. We came to a conclusion here in the Senate as to a bipartisan background checks proposal that could get 50 votes in 2013, and I'd love to start that process again. But there's no reason not to do it, because all the evidence tells us that when we make sure that only the right people buy guns, a lot less people die from gun crimes. And it's not controversial anywhere except for Washington, D.C. Everybody out there in the American public wants us to pass universal background checks. Maybe some other interventions in this space are a little bit more controversial, split folks a little bit more, but not background checks. This thing is decided outside of the Senate chamber and the House chamber. Popular in the public, deeply impactful, will save thousands and thousands of lives. You know, that's a triple that you don't get very often here, and we should take advantage of the opportunity. Let me just leave you with this. I convened a panel a couple nights ago to talk about the importance of background checks, and I had a number of parents of those who were lost to gun violence. One of the parents was from Sandy Hook. Another was a parent of a child who was killed in Chicago. And she really wanted to make sure that we knew what the real impact of gun violence in America was. She wanted to make sure that we knew that the victims aren't just those that show up on the police blotter. The victims are the parents and the brothers and the sisters and the friends and the coworkers. The average number of people who experience some diagnosable trauma when somebody in their life is shot and killed is 20. So when you hear the number that 100 people in the United States die every day from guns, which is a number 10 to 20 times higher than in any other high-income nation on a per capita basis, you have to understand that number really isn't 100, right? That number is 20 times higher than that, because the people that have to live with that loss, right, who have to ask these questions, why did they shoot themselves? What do I do about that individual who shot my son? How do I get over that combination of pain and anger? That's hard to understand unless you've spent this time with the mothers and the fathers who are dealing with this catastrophic, life-changing trauma for the rest of the time that they're on this earth. And so that's why this is so serious to me, is that we've got an answer for their pain. Not an answer that will stop every gun crime in this country, but an answer that will result in thousands less people dying. We know that because the evidence tells us that. And I can't explain to these families, to that mother in Chicago, why something that is proven to work and is supported by 90% of Americans can't get a vote or a debate in the United States Senate. I'll leave it at that for today, because I hope that when this passes in the House with a big bipartisan majority, that we take advantage of the opportunity to get a big bipartisan majority here in the United States Senate. If the Republican majority commits to starting that process, I guarantee you that that will be the result. I want to thank all of the people who made this possible in the House today. For the record, I've introduced a version of H.R. 8 here in the United States Senate, but to Chairman Nadler and to Mike Thompson, to Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer, and to their Republican co-sponsors who have helped bring it to the floor, I thank them on behalf of all of the folks that they will never know those lives that they have saved by their action today, if we do the right thing and take it up here in the United States Senate. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.